this time. Should be right.
The light's not fantastic in here. I look like about I'm 90 at the moment.
You look fine, mate.
Yeah, I know I was ugly before I started. Thanks for that.
Right, right. I'm going to send you. I'm going to send you it in a separate email here, and then I'll get that out to myself. Live. Right, that should be with you now. And that is muted on my end. Right. And I need to send that to myself and then get it out to social media. Publish now. Right.
Okay, we're muted, mate. Looking good.
Good. Right. So yeah, for whoever's joining at the moment, yeah, we're just getting everything sorted. So give us a couple of minutes while I get this out to social media, and then we'll crack on. So right, need to do it here. Muted. Hi Alexander, how you doing, mate? Right, I think I got that link. So yeah, Mids, have you had your tea yet, or might call it dinner down there?
Yeah. Fed, watered, ready to go, mate.
Ready to go, perfect. Hi Brockwell, how are you doing, mate? Can you see all the comments coming in there, Mids?
Yeah, I got Alexander, Brockwell, and John looking all good. Hope the audio works okay. You're a little bit quiet to me, but that's not an issue.
It should be okay. I'll turn it up just a tad. So as you all know, guys, it takes me a couple of minutes while I get this out on social media, and then I'll give you a bit of background on Mids if you don't already know, but I'm sure you already know what he's flown. Right, here we go. Twitter. Link is out. Tweet. Hi Adam, how you doing, mate? So yeah, while I get this out, Mids, yeah, what's been up with you since we last talked? I think it was maybe June or July. I can't remember, but it was definitely at least 3 months ago. But what's been happening in your world?
Well, not a huge amount really. COVID's still got a lot of working from home. I was previously working with the Director of Flying Trainings area, looking after fast jet training within the military flying training system. But I've moved across to the Military Aviation Authority now and look after effectively third-party assurance for all fixed-wing areas of the British military, which is a bit of a change and really interesting, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. So tell us about while we get the questions in, and I'll tell everyone once, because it's still not 7 o'clock yet. But yeah, so what's been the rollout in Germany, and how long have you been there for?
I had a little bit of a while. The MAA really is travelling around the UK doing safety work more than anything. But as a sideline, my previous time out in the CAOC in Germany, I got into working with air command and control a lot. So one of the things that I did was help design and manage NATO's large joint, both live and synthetic exercises. Whilst I was out at Linton flying Tucano, I was very reluctant to spend time not flying the aeroplane. So spending 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks every quarter or every 4 months off doing exercises wasn't as attractive as perhaps it sounds. But now on a more ground-based tour, not doing the flying, it's quite nice to get my hand back in the NATO environment. So a couple of weeks ago, I was out for a week helping to design the events and incidents for a large NATO air exercise, synthetic. And then next week for a fortnight, I'm out helping them execute it. Before I used to look after the training elements for the operations centre. What I'm actually doing on this one is providing the enemy view. So I'm battle captain for Red Air, running the opposition to the exercise, which will be good
Wow.
fun as well.
So do you actually get any trips up there, or is it more on the ground kind of stuff?
No, this one's sadly synthetic. It'd be really nice to do some of the enemy flying stuff, but unfortunately, no, I get stuck. Darkened room in the middle of an air operations centre, just providing inputs into the simulation.
So yeah, what kind of aircraft are over there on that exercise or in that deployment?
Anything in the NATO orbit, basically. So it's quite an interesting. It's an interesting environment to practice in. If we go live flying, I did one live flying exercise a few years ago, and there are about 2,500 sorties over 4 weeks, with about 10 different nations types. So yeah, it gets really interesting.
Awesome. So we're getting the people in now because it's almost 7 o'clock, which I stated. But yeah, so guys, I'm going to just give you a bit of background, whoever's joining us now, about Mids. We've had him on the show before for a Q&A, as I say, about 3 months ago. And obviously, we interviewed him down at Boscombe Down. That was a great day. I really enjoyed that. We filmed in front of the Hawk. But Mids has flown, well, he's had a great career. He's flown the F-4 Phantom, the Tornado F-3, the greatest aircraft ever made. And he's also trained on, instructed on the Tucano, flew the Grob, and yeah, he's had a great career. But yeah, tell us just a brief summary from yourself, Mids, like how long you spent in the RAF.
Sounds like 1,000 years. Joined the Royal Air Force in 1980. At the tender age of 18, I had 9 days off between leaving school and joining the service. Went through flying training in 3 years. Arrived on the Phantom OCU on my 21st birthday. Was flying the F-4 from, I think, 21 and 2 months old. Spent all of the 80s flying the F-4 pretty much to the end. Good chunk of the 90s flying the F-3. And then from there, I moved into flying training, ran a University Air Squadron. I've also done chief instructor at Cranwell. Most recently, OC Operations Wing at Linton-on-Ouse, flying the Tucano. Beyond that, outside of the flying, and as you'll appreciate, a typical military pilot spends about 75% of the time on flying tours, but the more senior you get, the less flying you do. So for the 25% I've got left, about 10 years of the career, I think, I've done air-to-air missile firing analysis at Valley at the air-to-air missile establishment. Done an accident investigation for 3 years, 97 to 2000. I've done a lot of air operations centre work, both in the UK, Malaysia and Germany, and Denmark as well. And a little bit of safety work thrown in with all of that. So a fairly wide variety of areas. I'm assuming you guys are most interested in the aeroplane side. That's certainly where most interest seems to be. But it's a varied career, and it's kept me busy, which is good.
Absolutely. So as you see for here, Mids, there's a few questions coming in, so I'm going to let you loose and I'll try and plug it a bit more on social media. But if you need me, just give us a shout. And guys, get your questions coming in because we're going to go until 8 o'clock UK time. That's 58 minutes from now. So enjoy, and yeah, hopefully you enjoy it too, Mids.
Okay, mate, no problem at all. For all the guys out there, good evening. Hope you're all good. I recognise a couple of names from last time. What I would say is I apologise for any mispronunciation of names. Some of the spellings are not necessarily as phonetic as the people expect them to be, and my English is pretty rubbish anyway. So if I get it wrong, just drop me a note correcting me. I will try as best I can to pronounce them as they are. We'll go down the list as they come in. Might jump over the odd person. I might move down the list a bit quickly depending on how we go. Happy to take questions on anything. What I'll do though is if there's anything that moves into areas I'm not allowed to talk about, then I'll just step over those. There's a bit of a delay in terms of messages coming into reality of about a minute, so I will talk against the messages, but it might seem as if your message is being a touch late. So that's kind of ground rules from there. Okay, kicking off with, I think it's Jing Zhang. Can I tell you the most memorable 1v1 BFM sortie in an F-4 against another Phantom or similar NATO aircraft? Perhaps any mission where you fought and beat a superior plane? Yeah, I did lots of 1v1 in the F-4. The aeroplane fought very well if you used it properly, often beating dissimilar aircraft types. One of the ones that sticks in my mind more than anything is towards the end of my time on the Phantom, I was out in Germany About the time the wall came down, so NATO inherited a lot of the East German types, one of which being the MiG-29. We spent 2 weeks out in Dechy, flying and fighting against the MiG-29, both in 1v1 and in larger formations. The reason it's memorable was it was the first time, certainly in the 10 years at the time I'd flown the aeroplane, that we actually came across what we considered to be the opposition. And it was interesting to see the capability of the aeroplanes that they flew and to be able to balance what we thought they were capable of against what we actually saw in the air. Two things that stuck in my mind about that. One was we were pretty close in our understanding of what to expect from them, which was interesting. That meant we were training in about the right levels. And the other one was that there were times when it felt as if you ought to have lost, but the systems in the MiG-29 were not as user-friendly for a Western pilot as perhaps somebody who was trained on them in East Germany. And we often got away with an unfavourable situation because the weapon system was so complicated to operate. It wasn't the same in any way as a Western fighter. So I think they stick in my mind more than anything else. Happy to take any more questions on that area if people fancy. Okay, going up a little bit. There's a little bit of a faff while I try and get all this sorted out. Here we go. From John Ellis, Grob T120 TP. Yeah, I did a little bit of time with T121 TP. Most of the time I flew Grob 115, the tutor, the earlier generation aeroplane. The late generation ones are a big step forward in the flying training system. Moving on a bit more. Again from Jing Zhang, describe what are the most tactical maneuvers or aerobatic maneuvers in the Phantom that require pilot skill or experience. Anything operating the aeroplane close to its limit. It's a very unforgiving aeroplane if you mishandle it, but it generates a trust and a feel that allows you to understand what it's doing. So if you're pulling a lot of angle of attack to the airflow, then the aeroplane effectively speaks to you. And as you build experience, you get to recognize what that means, what it feels like, and therefore you can use it to your advantage, which is something I've always enjoyed more than anything else. The Tornado was a great aeroplane, without a doubt. I've been bribed to say that, obviously, by Mike, but the F-4 was a real proper pilot's aeroplane, which is really the thing that used to be enjoyable about flying it. I think that's the way I'd put it. It was a great aeroplane to fly, if not very hard work. James Mintram, officer side for me. Morning, Minty. More important than the aviation side, officer first, pilot second. Yeah, it is. It is officer first. You are expected to have standards and you are expected to behave in a certain way and expected to lead people. That's kind of where the job is. And if you look at my profile, where I've done time in the air and time on the ground, the latter has involved looking after people, managing them, running them and leading them. So, yeah, it is. What I would say for 90% of their crew, plus it's the flying that has driven us into the career we're in, we often then get to understand how good it is to lead and manage people as a secondary effect. Steve Lehman, what felt faster, F3 or F4? F3 was undoubtedly a faster aeroplane, but it was a generation later in reality, a lot more clinical and more sophisticated than the F4. So 600 to 700 knots in an F4 felt incredibly fast. The cockpit noise was incredible. There was no noise cancelling system on the microphones or on the helmets, so as the noise of the airflow over the cockpit particularly got louder and louder in F4, the only answer was to shout at each other. And if you've been doing a lot of high-speed work, then you often came back hoarse from shouting to be understood for the guy in the back. The F3 was always a very clinical, controlled environment, much quieter, much more sophisticated, for want of a better term. The downside of that was in an F4, you barely had to look at the airspeed indicator to know what speed you were doing, to know how hard to pull, because the sound gave everything away. There were times in the F3 where you couldn't tell the difference between 350 knots or 550 knots. It was that clinical and that controlled an environment, which meant in a way you were more reliant on the information you would be given in the head-up display than in an F4, which had a better feel to it. Next one then, due to Pete Harris. I knew somebody would pick up a Brexit question somewhere. Is Brexit going to have any significant impact on the NATO cooperation in terms of flying training exercise between NATO partners? What I would say is that NATO has, in reality, nothing to do with Brexit. So NATO is a completely separate organisation. It's a completely separate environment. We have changed nothing about the way we join, use, work with, and contribute to NATO. So in terms of flying training, exercising between partners, I don't see there being any difference whatsoever. Alexander Vatter tells us about the best air-to-air weapon in the NATO inventory. I can't really do that, mate. I am sorry about that. It's a good question. I'm just not really at liberty to say. It's a bit too close to the bit. Jamie Hago. Hey, mate, how you doing? Who's the best Fleet Air Arm Tucano pilot? I'm sorry, mate, there were no good ones. I was obviously the best of all of them. There was a couple of pretty average guys from the Fleet Air Arm Flew Tucano. I can't quite remember them now. For everybody else out there, Jamie and I were both at Linton at the same time. He's an absolutely top guy. Fleet Air Arm background. Flew Tornadoes as well. It was instructing with us down at Linton, and it just shows you the joint nature of the organisation there. And it's nice to see a little bit of banter from him there. He was always aggressively average, so it's nice to hear from him. Brock Lane, how does the Tucano's performance compare with the World War II Warbird? I had a very quick look at the basics of what a Tucano did when I first got there. There was a lot of people talked about it. Its performance was comparable with a very early Hurricane Mark 1. So I used to refer to it as going flying in the Hurricane simulator, which was quite nice. We also had one done up in camouflage, which was really good because you'd be flying along. It got about a 800 odd horsepower engine, large propeller, little square wing. You'd look out over the Yorkshire Dales, and there you'd see a camouflage wing with a great big old-fashioned 1941 roundel on it, which was absolutely fantastic to see. So, yeah, about the performance of a Hurricane, and if you put it into context, you know, that was the pinnacle of, if you like, Battle of Britain Aviation. They were the leading edge of fighter design, and we're using it as the very, very first stage of the fast-track jet training pipeline. So it just shows how things have advanced in time. Zigzag's Ground Zero Wall Department. That's one of the longest handles I've seen so far. There's a question of how long would NATO have lasted in a conventional nuclear war against the Warsaw Pact forces. A really difficult question. There's a lot read up on it. There's a lot looked at it. We had very different philosophies. We had very different capabilities. I think both sides, if you ask people from them, I've worked with a lot of Eastern Europeans who were around at that time, were confident that we would probably have been victorious, as indeed anybody from the Warsaw Pact had a very similar feeling. One thing I would say is the conflict would likely to be very short in terms of initial exchanges in aviation. How it would then pan out, I don't know. I've seen everything from lasting 5 days to a week to a long slog with attrition that could last for months, days, weeks, years, whatever was in there. So difficult question, one I'm probably not doing a very good job of answering there. So how's the user interface in the Tornado compared with the F-4? The early Phantom, when I flew it, didn't have hands-on throttle and stick. So to make any switch selections, you had to move your hand and often look into the cockpit. That was definitely not the optimal way of operating the aeroplane. About half my time on the aeroplane, mid-80s, we got the F-18A stick top, and therefore we had a better hands-on throttle and stick capability. Still somewhat limited, but it did mean to select a different weapon. You didn't have to take your hands off the stick, and that was actually very, very useful. Tornado F3 was designed with that as a concept, so the stick and throttle had good HOTAS. Most of the modes you'd need in the air were on it, so in effect it had the better user interface between the weapon system and the aeroplane. Just going back one while I just manipulate the software as a touch, excuse me. So Steve Lehman here. Have I ever flown the Chipmunk, or was that before my time? He flew them with cadets in the late 80s. Yeah, I've flown the Chipmunk a little bit. I flew it as an air cadet with the 70s, in the late 70s. I think the air cadets were a fantastic organisation. They've moved more towards a youth organisation, which is incredibly good now, and then almost twice the size of the Royal Air Force, so that's interesting. Flying the Chipmunk, I flew it several times whilst holding in the flying training system. I had some very short holds. Flew it with Abingdon AEF for a short while as well. Great little aeroplane, very much flying in its purest sense. And in a lot of ways, there are similarities with the Grob 115, which I later flew both on the UAS and as a chief instructor at Cranwell. Getting a laughing emoji from Hago. Cheers, mate. James Mintram again, Minty. So what was the most memorable operation sorties over Bosnia? Bosnia was interesting in two ways. Firstly, it was largely peacekeeping, so a lot of it was presence sorties. I was on the cap the morning that Scott O'Grady got shot down in the afternoon, so that made for an interesting story or two in the morning. But some of the most interesting stuff was flying at night and trying to prevent air-land operations affecting the civilian population by denying them the airspace to operate in. And that was probably some of the more demanding operations we did. Low flying in the valleys, in the dark, trying to stop helicopters moving forces around. Interesting environment, very challenging and very professionally rewarding. Krieger 22FS. Do I have any memorabilia of the Phantom or the Autonato that's particularly sentimental value to me? He's resting his head on a plush Phantom while typing this. Yeah, I've got kind of a few little bits and pieces of memorabilia that I've kept. I've got a Sidewinder and a Skyflash fin from when I was down in the Falklands as the boss, with particular paintings on that are of value to me. Got a few little things I've been given as gizzits over the time, all of which are memorabilia that just tickle memories. Sadly, I didn't take many photos, or have a lot more framed by now. Jamie Hago, opening line, you'd love the PC-21 shippers. Thanks, mate. That's great. He said if the Tucano was a Hurricane Mark 1, then his PC-21 he's flying out in the Gulf at the moment is a Spitfire 9. Yeah, thanks for that. That's not improved my morale, Jamie, but it has made me smile. Cheers. Zigzag Ground Zero War Department says, thank you. A pleasure, mate. No issues whatsoever. Nice to talk to people. All right, the Feckle Pooney. I mispronounced yours last time, mate, and I bet I've got it wrong again this time. Hi, how are you doing? How responsive were the engines on the F3? Interesting in terms of response. Most jet engines, the higher the bypass rate, the slower the response is. RB119 was not a massive turbo fan, so it didn't have huge response times you see on airliners. But the Ador and the 119 from the Ador from the Hawk were very similar. About idle to full power takes 5 seconds of responsiveness. The F-4 was probably the same, but the difference was the F-4 had a mechanical fuel control unit. So if you just slammed the throttle from idle to full power and left it, it would probably pop surge. The engine certainly wouldn't like it. It wouldn't overtemp, but it would growl at you. Both the Tornado F3 and the Hawk in its later time were much more reliable and responsive engine controls, and the F3 particularly, having flown the F4 first, was almost carefree handling on the engines. But most aeroplanes really have some lag if they're a jet. You just have to take that into account when you're flying. You kind of have to think you'll need power ahead of when you need it. And if you don't need it, then it's really easy to counter it by closing the throttle before the power bites. Alexander Vatter, MiG-29, was not really built for BVR arena, as he understands, and the Eastern pilots weren't taught to think and act independently. I think you're absolutely right. I met some of the MiG-29 guys, both then and a little bit later, and their philosophy was different. You know, the MiG was really just an extension of their radar system. It was tallied by or keyed onto the enemy by data link through the radar system, and much of the firing solution was designed to be done in that way. However, what I would say is the aeroplane maneuverability and some of the kit on it was actually very good for the BVR arena. Their very simplistic helmet-mounted sight was very effective. The missiles that they used in AA-10 was very, very good short range. And that overall, the aeroplane itself could maneuver exceptionally well. So whilst the pilots weren't necessarily taught to think and act independently, the aeroplane had the capability to do that. And I certainly saw sometime later than the sorties I described, when the wall had come down and I was over at Valley, the West German Air Force was starting to exploit the aeroplane's capabilities and were doing quite well in using its advantages where needed. The philosophy was they'd enter the fight with an F-4 and bring a MiG-29 along to do the short-range fighting with it. It's a shame in a way that the MiG was never updated to a proper Western avionics, because I think you'd have a good platform there. Lackey strikes, what would be my preferred opponent 1v1 and 2vx, Sea Harriers or Lightnings? Have fought both. FRS 1 Harriers were nowhere near as effective as the FRS 2s, which were actually very good. I know Hago will hate me saying that. I don't myself for it. But yeah, Sea Harrier was a pretty good aeroplane in its later stages. The Bimbrook Lightnings were fantastic to fight 1v1. The performance was not that dissimilar to an F4. What they lacked, though, was a head-on radar-laid missile capability and a pod stopper radar. So whilst in a close-in fight, Lightnings were great fun to fight. Probably an even balance, to be honest, between the Phantom and the Lightning, clean Phantom and a Lightning. We actually had a better weapons system, which gave us the edge in the real world, so to speak. Mike Child, watch out of the Tornado. Which out of the Tornado and Phantom would you have felt more comfortable taking into combat, and why? I think you have to put context onto that. So in the 80s, I'd have happily taken a Phantom to war, particularly in RAF Germany. It was pretty much the best platform NATO had out there in the mid-80s. Even the spangly new F-15s were nowhere near as effective, and that was the quality of the crews we had and the training that they had. If I could have put a Tornado F-3 from the late 90s into that scenario, it would have been head and shoulders above anything else that was out there. However, you've got to fast forward 10 plus years, F-15 had become a lot more capable an aeroplane, the crews had a lot more experience, and therefore Tornado, which was also far, far better, was not quite as ahead of everybody else. What I would say, though, if you compared the two together in the same time frame, Tornado was, again, much, much better. When we then put Link 16 JTIDs into Tornado, it became a completely different weapon system, and that was head and shoulders again amongst quite a lot of what there was out there in the world. And about 1996, I did a red flag in the States with 5 and 29 Squadron on the Tornado F3 with Link 16 JTIDs, and we got the most favourable kill ratio of any of the participants and some of the best kill ratios they'd seen in red flag for quite some time. So it just goes you capability of how good the aeroplane was in its later days. I am Minty again. What's my favourite patch from the flying time? I think my favourite patch is the one that my squadron had when I ran East Midlands UAS. It's not an operational patch as such, but it was a picture of a cartoon emu with its clouds around its middle, blue background above, red background above. At the top, it had fly like gods, and on the bottom, it's had drink like Satan, which is a little bit politically incorrect these days, but it's a patch I particularly liked. Here we go. 1903, Chris Holden. When COVID's over, would I be willing to sign Phantom and Tornado books if possible? Yeah, of course I would. No issues with that. If you go through Mike, he can get in touch with me, and then we can probably do something there. Freckle Pony's doing him fine. That's good, mate. And I think I'm getting the pronunciation about right. Adam Cotton, hi Adam. What's my opinion of the F-35? And would you rather fly it over the Typhoon? No, I think the Typhoon is a fighter pilot's aircraft. It's Gen 4 and a bit, for want of how you describe it. It's got pretty awesome performance. It's got Meteor and ASRAAM. It's just a really, really competent air defence platform. F-35 isn't that competent air defence platform in its purest form. It's a very, very, very effective and competent interdiction platform. It delivers weapon effect to the enemy. But at my heart, I'm a fighter pilot, and I'd want the aeroplane that in its design concept was optimised for hunting, stalking and killing other aeroplanes. So Typhoon would get my vote any day. There we go. John Ennis, do I think fast jet pilots get enough training hours to be safe within tight budgets, etc.? That's a really good question. Define safe, define training, define competent. We have to give the best possible value for money for the public's purse. So there is always a balance, and there always was when I was learning to fly, between a training system that was long enough and produced a high enough standard against a training system that cost too much and was too long and too slow. We're starting to see innovative training coming in as well now. So there's more 360 video. I'd like to see more virtual reality balancing off the live flying. But in the end, my own personal view is we shouldn't compromise the live flying and give the guys too little simply because it's expensive to do. If you want the best fighter pilots in the world, then experience in the aeroplane is still one of the best ways of delivering it. And my personal view is simulators can be great, they can be incredibly good, but in the back of your mind is always that one little bit that if I get this wrong, it's a simulator. Whereas when you're coming back at night on one engine with an issue to a 200-foot cloud base in the dark and the rain, that's when you earn your money. And it's only experience and currency in the air that will give you the technology, the capability to do that. You can do as many simulators as you like, but if you've never really experienced that, I think you're poorly placed to do well at it. So Alexander Vatter asked differently, should the German Typhoons get Meteor 5 years ago? Like the RAF ones? Yes, I think the Meteor and Typhoon is one of the best weapon systems out there. Certainly better than, I would say, all of the competition, if I was being 100% honest. I can't judge why the German government elected not to, but I don't think that was a sensible decision. Not that I can actually influence the political decisions that go around these things. Lakish strikes again. Did I routinely end up under 120 knots in the F-4 in BFM? And did we have to go into the incipient spin phase and slow speed fights reverse direction quickly? It's an interesting one. The aeroplane fought best if you didn't take it slow and you didn't get into a slow fight. If you could use the vertical, that was great. But at the moment, particularly with F-16 and those generations of aircraft, you got slow, nose low, then you invariably, if you came across a guy who did the same, you would lose. However, there were times when you can get the speed low, reverse the aeroplane quickly. And in the vertical, if you were going vertically upwards, you can use roll to get across the circle because the aeroplane worked very well that way. What I would say is that the aeroplane is unpredictable in its incipient spin, and if you didn't get it right, it would lose 10,000 feet and probably try and kill you. So no, we didn't do what you would describe as an incipient spin phase, as you would in a conventional aeroplane, doing a flick roll, for instance, to get a reverse speed, reverse direction very quickly. What the F-4 used to do, though, was reverse direction very quickly with their aileron and rudder combined. I think we used to get about 540 degrees a second if you did those two aggressively. So a typical technique, even at slow speed, was to unload the aeroplane from the angle attack, full stick, full rudder, centralize, and then reload the aeroplane up. And that would give you a very good roll rate to reverse direction without any of the careful handling required to do it right close to the limits of the aeroplane. Hope that answered your question there. The Freckle Pony again, given how some countries still operate the F-4, such as Greece and Turkey, could the RAF have eked a few more years out of them? Yes, absolutely we could. There were a bunch of programs that were being looked at when the aeroplane was in its later days, single glass front cockpit, potentially putting in a better radar, potentially putting Amraman, as the Germans did with their aeroplanes. And those things were all being looked at. However, went down from an air force of 98,000 all the way down now to 35. The Cold War had gone. These things were expensive. And it was a case of balancing out what we had. Without doubt, the aeroplane could have gone on, but we already had a large force of Tornadoes on the way. Tornado F-3 was starting to pan out as a very good aeroplane. So where do you put your investment? An aeroplane which, towards the end of its life, had flown 4,500 hours. Many were limited on the fatigue life they had left. They had not had many careful owners. The RN flew all of the FG1s without any kind of G meters, so they were pretty tired by the time they went into Air Force custody. Some of the aircraft were developing spar cracks towards the end of their life due to fatigue and were being managed very carefully. So I think we put the investment in the right time into the right airframe, which was Tornado F-3. I hope that answered your question there. Zigzag Ground Zero War Department, that is, I say, the longest handle I've seen. Any Cold War spy stories or spies or base encounters? Did the KGB ever infiltrate the forces with hot lady spooks? Not that I know of. The only thing I encountered anywhere was the UK, Russia, America and France had what were known as missions. So the British mission was a mission that was allowed to travel through all the areas of Germany, and the Soviet mission was exactly the same. And that mission used to travel through West Germany, and quite often the role was to observe what was going on in Germany as part of the end of Second World War arrangements. I did once meet a Russian mission. I'll describe him as an individual because he was in civilian clothes, so I don't know what he was. But he parked a camper van at the back of one of the QRA sheds at Wildenrath. We had an aeroplane out that needed an engine run, and he was parked right next to the fence taking pictures directly behind the aeroplane. I wandered out to the fence and asked him very nicely if he would move his van. And his reply was that he was part of the Russian mission and he would park his van wherever he liked. So when we started up the aeroplane, the first thing I saw was I think we blew his front windscreen in and the doors off the back, and I watched him charging across the field chasing pieces of paper, which I thought was quite amusing. Not sure if that's the level of story you're after, but it's one that made me smile. How are we going down again? Steve Lehman, any fighter that I would have loved to fly, maybe from the 80s and 90s rather than the current. I've always wanted to fly Typhoon. I've flown the Sim. It's pretty awesome. I think I said that last time. If you were going to give me something to fly from the early ages, bit of a left field choices, I would always like to have flown the Gloucester Javelin. There's something about the massive double delta that appeals to me. It was one of the very first proper radar equipped fighters. And whilst it wasn't the most awesome in terms of performance, it's just one of those things that attracts me, and I find it absolutely fascinating in terms of being an aeroplane. Are we going down then? Minty, hello again, mate. Obviously, this is a little sensitive. He's not expecting any details, but with regards to JTs, does this allow for jets such as the F-3 to set up an ambush by running passive? You've answered the questions at the start, mate, so I'm going to jump straight over that one. Go down to the next one. Arclight, hi, David. Does it really feel to how does it really feel to fire a live missile? I fired missiles off both the Phantom and the Tornado. There's a combination of excitement and pressure. Missiles are massively expensive. In the 80s, a Skyflash was about the same cost as a kidney machine for a hospital. So we used to joke that every missile firing, you were firing a kidney machine. But what we were doing on most of the firing was testing a corner of the envelope of the missile to confirm that what we thought in terms of design and performance was actually borne out in reality. So we'd fly not in the heart of the missile envelope, but towards its edge, which meant it had to be set up really carefully. So there'd be huge amounts of pressure, and quite often the trigger press and the bang and whoosh of the missile was more of a relief than it was of an excitement. And of course, the next thing you would do is break out to avoid any potential debris from when the missile exploded, hitting its target. So it was very different from perhaps how you might imagine. The one thing I would say that Skyflash off a Phantom or a Tornado was a slightly remote clunk bang type sensation. But a sidewinder off both aeroplanes went off the wing and went quite close to the cockpit, so you'd hear it really loud. And for the Tornado, the one I fired was an inboard right-hand wing station to a target that was on the left of the nose going away. And the bang and the whoosh and the fact the missile went straight across the nose, literally in front of me, I'd describe as quite alarming. The bang particularly was a surprise, even though I know it was coming. So, yeah, pretty good to do. Very nice to do the professional job. But as I say, most of the time it was quite a relaxing effort to get the thing off and go, didn't make a mess of that. Brockwell Lane, did I train with vegans? No, mate, I'm sorry, I didn't. Lovely aeroplane, though, something I'd love to have seen and had a go against. One of my all-time favourites is the Gripen as well. So they produced some good stuff up there in Sweden. North 34th Street, he's just someone going on to senior year. As a child, he always wanted to be a pilot, soaring through the skies. In all my years, how would you round up my career? Thank you for my service. Much appreciated for your thanks. Thank you. I don't know. My wife always tells me you can grow up or be a pilot, and I kind of look at that as being a compliment. It's a great career. I've loved every minute of it. I particularly have always been driven to fly. So whilst I've done time on the ground, in the back of my mind, I think has always been yes, I'll be back in the air at some point. And whenever I've had the opportunity to fly, I've maximised that. So my last tour as OC-Ops at Linton, I was a fully qualified line QFI for the Tucano, which was excellent. That meant I could fly with the students as and when the opportunities arose. I tried to fly 4 times a week. I was generally speaking successful with at least 3 sorties a week. And as Jamie Haggo will say, if he's still listening, that was pretty much as any of the QFIs on the squadron were doing, despite me running the airfield, being aerodrome operator and senior operator for the aeroplane. So it's the flying that's always driven me. And I think that's what I would round up the career with. It's been a great flying career. And if you're 58.5 years old and you could still pull 6G, go off do inverted spinning and aerobatics and come back with a massive smile on your face, it's always a good thing. Interestingly, most of the students used to know how to keep me happy when I was flying with them, which was at the end of the sortie that they were running was always a quick 5 minutes. So would you like to just do some aeros? Which I thought was very astute of them, but it did keep me happy in the middle of everything. So it's a great career, and I'd fly it up. I think my roundup is lots of flying, but lots of interest in different things. Jonathan Harris, hi Jonathan. Any aircraft I flew that I felt were retired prematurely? I'm guessing I'd say the F-4 was retired prematurely in reality. But again, as I explained earlier, the F-3 was there. We needed to downsize the service, so that was the sensible decision. Other than that, we're pretty good at getting the maximum out of our aeroplanes. So Tucano, much as I loved it, most of the aeroplanes had a life of 5,200 flying hours, and virtually everyone at the end was above 5,000. So we pretty much as a service get the maximum out of the aeroplanes. And of course, as an aeroplane fatigues and ages, you start to get limitations on it, and that's not what you want in a military aeroplane. What we got next then? The World 487. What advice would you give to someone entering the RF flying training system over the next year or so? And do you wish you had done anything differently? Don't wish I'd done anything differently. I joined at 18, was flying Phantoms at 21, and I've had a fantastic career since and loved every minute of it. Even the ground tours have been fascinating. And sometimes you do need a couple of years off from the pressures of flying and what is a fairly brutal regime of detachments. So no, I wouldn't do anything differently. If you're entering the training system now, do your homework. It's massively competitive. We're taking fewer pilots than when I joined for fewer places. And the entry standards, both educationally and everything else you can imagine, are very high. But the thing that stands out more than anything is a will to be an RF pilot and a determination to succeed, and people who've done the background research that's needed to make that work. So it's your determination, your drive, and the work you do to do it that stands out when you're in the training system. LZ, what are my thoughts on Tempest? Do you think it need to give it? It will need it given the longevity of modern platforms. Yeah, I do. I think any nation that elects not to keep up with the edges of technology is immediately on a losing stance. So if I look at the A10 F-35 argument, it's not an argument in reality. A nation has to go into the latest technology to be credible in terms of both its drive and determination to succeed and also its capability. A10 was not an edge of performance platform when it came in. It wasn't an edge of technology platform, but it does what it does incredibly well. So comparing those two isn't really fair on either platform. A10 needs to be replaced by something that's an A10, and it's pretty much the way to do it. Now, I'd say the same with Tempest. Tempest will be next generation. It will have the capabilities to keep the UK credible in any theatre and with any partner through the next 30 to 40 years. I don't buy that fighter aeroplanes remain credible for lots and lots of years. The F-4, much as I love it, is not credible in modern technology against an F-22 or a Typhoon. Even with the weapon systems brought up to date, they're just not credible. So if you want an air force that is credible, that can defend itself, particularly with expensive platforms when numbers are low, then you need to invest in the future, and that's exactly what Tempest is. My personal view is I'm hoping Tempest stays a single nation program, because that makes it more straightforward in terms of what you want out of it. And I hope that my government doesn't mess around with it too much in terms of trying to save pennies continually, and we invest in making it the best in the world. That's where we should really be. Okay, David Broadman was the Phantom, so I'm guessing you're talking Phantom FRS2 better than the Tornado F3. Contextually, again, go to where you are. The Phantom was great in its day, the Tornado was great in its day, but a Tornado F3 with AMRAAM, ASRAAM, data link is a far, far better platform. Much as it hurts me to say it, the two are of different times, and the F3 was much better to go to war with, without a doubt. Jing Zhang, how did you navigate over the sea at night on an FG1 in the absence of INAS? I can quite safely say that the loneliest place in the world is an FG1 low level in the Iceland-Faroes Gap in February on a dark, cold, miserable winter's night. The only nav kit we had in an FG1, and for those of you that aren't familiar with this, the FGR2 had an inertial nav system, which, whilst it wasn't in the same ways as a GPS-derived modern system, it would give you a location within 4, 5, 10 miles after a couple of hours. That was more than good enough to find Scotland from the middle of the Iceland-Faroes Gap. Because the FG1 was carrier designed, and in those days there wasn't a way of finding a stable, non-moving reference to align an inertial navigation system. All of the naval F-4 variants of the early generations, I can't quite confirm if the S was the same, had no way of aligning an inertial nav system, so they didn't fit them with one. So it, in reality, had no navigation kit other than a tactical air navigation beacon, TACAN. What it did have was a thing we used to refer to as the chocolate mouse, which was a analog movement processor, is the best way I can describe it. It would take acceleration and movement of the aeroplane in terms of its speed, height, direction, and work out where the aeroplane had gone from wherever you told it where it was when it started. And you could put in a wind that it would take into account. So it was kind of a very simplistic navigation system. It relied on the accuracy of the wind you put in, the accuracy of the starting point you gave it, but also it wasn't that accurate intrinsically in terms of detecting the movement that it was doing. I've seen that 200 miles out in 200 miles, so it wasn't really good enough for navigating over the sea. So what do we do then? Well, we used TACAN till we went out of TACAN range, and then literally all you did was run in your head, heading and time equals distance. So if you're flying at 7 miles a minute, you're heading 330, you fly for 10 miles, you've got 10 minutes, you've gone 70 miles. That's an order of magnitude. So you know if you want to go to back where you started, then you turn around, you head 150, you go for 10 minutes, you get back to the same part. If you do that over a course, you can work out roughly what the heading is to get back to roughly where you started, or at least to a point where you would expect to find a TACAN. Used it many times when there was no nav aids. It gets a bit fraught if you're trying to fright the aeroplane and work out where you are at the same time. But most of us on the force could do that quite well. And we never really came back with what I'd call totally lost. You might come back and be 40 miles out from where you think you are, maybe 50. But that in itself wasn't a massive issue when you're looking at the ranges and times that we would fly for. How's that? Mike Child, thank you again for another question. How challenging is it to master the skill of taking on fuel in flight? Is it easier on some aircraft types than others? I can't vouch for every type. The F-4 I thought was easier than the F-3. The F-4 Pro was over your right shoulder, so you couldn't see it. So the secret was to take the E2B compass, which used to sit just on the right-hand top end of the canopy arch, put that on the hose of the basket, or the refueling hose, which had the sort of basket on the end of it. And then as you went forwards, you ran the E2 up the hose. That gave you an approach that put the basket in about the right place. And then as it went past your right ear, you got an order of scale, and you just left, right, up and down from there. And what you must never, ever do is look at the basket, because it's almost impossible looking at the basket to maneuver the aeroplane to move the probe around, because when you roll the aeroplane, the probe moves. F3, and that had a little effect with airflow over the nose, but not a great deal. The F3 was on the other side, sticking forward more, and that had much more effect with airflow over the nose, would move the basket away from the aeroplane. So if you ran up the line correctly, as you got to the basket, it moved out and you missed. Now, in both types, the great advantage was to have navigators in the back. So the guys would talk how you were doing. They would know how much the basket would move, and therefore they could give you indications of where your approach was, and therefore how accurate it was, and whether you needed to go up, left, right, down by, and they'd do 6 inches a foot. They all had their own style of letting you know how much to move and how quickly. There was the odd guy when you would get up, missed at 12 o'clock, but that happened very rarely. And most of the navs were absolutely worth their weight in gold for doing those sort of things. And you always had somebody on detachment to have a beer with, which I considered to be an advantage. What have we got down here then? So another Fuckle Puni. Freckle Pony rather, which gives you the most kick in the back, the Afterburner on an Afterburner takeoff, Tornado, F3 or Phantom. The Phantom, I think, did. The aeroplanes were subtly different. So in F4, you wound the aeroplane up to 80% each side. If you tried to do full non-reheat power on the brakes, it would drag the tyres off the wheels. So there was that much poke there. You got about 24,000 pounds of thrust. You'd let the brakes off, go from 80% to 100%. You'd rock the throttles outbound. You'd feel one kick, and then you'd go full reheat, and you'd feel a massive kick next time. The Tornado was more subtle, so you'd select full power on the brakes. It was a 32,000 pounds of thrust on the brakes. F4, by the way, was 40,000 pounds of thrust, full thrust, and on a 34,000 pound aeroplane. So with light fuel weights, you had a better than 1-to-1 power to weight ratio. Tornado was about 16,000 pounds of thrust, so the kick in mil power was less. And the reheat took you, I think, off the top of my head, to about 32,000 pounds of thrust. So you got a fairly big kick with the reheat, but it was nowhere as impressive or spectacular. Where the Tornado really had a massive advantage was the F4, and particularly the FGR2, because the Spey engines were slightly chubbier than the J models we had later with the J79s. The F4 had a lot more drag. So Tornado, once it was accelerating, would accelerate very well. And as the wings went back and you started to get near to supersonic, the drag coefficient was quite low. And the aeroplane just kept accelerating. And it would accelerate through the sound barrier very, very effectively. The F4 would get to about 0.9 Mach and its acceleration would start to slow down as transonic drag took effect. So the F4 was probably more kick on the ground. But the Tornado, if I remember rightly, used to accelerate about 50 knots every 5 to 6 seconds. The F4 was a touch slower, and much slower as you got closer to the Mach. Hope that answered your question there. How are we doing then? Jingzhang, what's the difference in between simulated missile launches in a simulator versus live? The physical experience in a live missile launch is very different. You'll feel the thump, you'll feel the bang, you'll hear the whoosh. And if the missile crosses the airframe, you'll feel the bump. You just can't simulate that in a simulator. You can make it close, but in the end, it's not the same thing. And I think it's just as simple as that. Okay, how are we doing now? So, crumbs, just lost a few people. Alexander Vata says at Zigzag, it was 1991 by RAF Tornado RAS. It's not very save attack prof. I didn't say attack profile. I didn't quite get that, mate. I'm sorry. Let's go up a little bit. So, Alexander Cotton, have I read Robert Press' book of his time flying the F4? If so, what's my opinion of it as a account in the daily life of an F4 pilot? I read that book just before I joined the Air Force, and that was my inspiration to be an F4 pilot. So I know a lot of the people he flew with, and it's a pretty good representation of life in an 80s Phantom squadron. He writes very well. He captures the balance of life between enjoyment and work and pressure extremely well, and I would recognise probably most of the things he did in that book. Yeah, it's a pretty good book, and it's very accurate from my view. I thought it was very, very good indeed. We're going to move down a little bit, see if I can find some people that we haven't answered so far. So Henley Spiteri. Hi, David. Any members of RF Luca Malta? Thank you. I sadly didn't get to do any of the missile practice camps in Malta. I always sort of wanted to, but I just didn't manage it, I'm afraid. That was such a disappointment. One of the things I would say about Malta was I did the air show a couple of times, and I was absolutely blown away by the kind openness of the people and their support for us as British military and their enthusiasm. So it's a fantastic island. I just wish I'd been able to do more of it there and visit it more professionally. Just one of those things. How we're doing a bit further on then. Zigzag Ground Zero. Oh no, sorry. Jonathan Harris, did I fly the F4J UK, and if so, what were the differences? I didn't fly it, but I was always fascinated by the differences, and a lot of my friends flew it. So a lot of the pilots liked the handling. It didn't go as far and wasn't as fuel efficient at low level as the Spey-powered aircraft. That's what we put the engine 4 in, was to go further at low level. The guys liked its higher air performance. The J79 performance didn't drop off with thin air like a Spey did. And the guys that flew it said it handled slightly better and accelerated slightly better. I do think it was probably closer to the FG1 than the FGR2. The FG1 was lighter, didn't have the ground attack kit in it, had drooping ailerons and a slotted tailplane, which the FGR2 didn't. And I think the J was a lot closer to that than it was the FGR2. So the pure spay difference was there, but also the FGR2 and FG1 were different aeroplanes as well. I think people are also fiercely loyal to their aircraft type. So you did get people who'd only flown the J who used to think the FGR2 was rubbish, and the other way around as well. Krieger 22FS, how much dissimilar air combat training was done with our other NATO allies? We do a lot dissimilar air combat training. We used to do loads, and we still do a fair amount. On the F-4, not only did we do dissimilar air combat training against all the NATO nations in the North Germany area, so US, Canada, Holland, Belgium. The French at the time weren't participating, but we would go to France and operate with them. Fighting other kinds of types give you a good indication of what it's like to fight aeroplanes that don't have the same performance as your own, which is of course key when fighting an enemy. We also used to do a lot of cross training as well. So within 2ATAF in Germany, we used to do an exercise called Ample Train, which was where you would take an aeroplane to somebody else's base, and those guys, the air force that you were joining or meeting, would turn the aeroplane for you. Sorry, Ample Gain it was called. So we'd land at Wittmanhaven, a German F-4 base in those days. We'd turn up at a German HAS, and the German ground crew, with our oversight, would put the fuel in, check the oils and all the other stuff. And about once a year, we used to do an exercise called Ample Train, which is where we would take the ground crews of probably 8 or 10 nations. We'd deploy with 8 or 10 nations worth of different aircraft types. We would have a very large flying exercise, which was always tremendous fun. And the ground crew would take it in turns with supervision from the host nation ground crew, as it were, to turn other people's aeroplanes. So you might land after a morning sortie and have a bunch of Spanish F-18 ground crew or Spanish Sea Harrier ground crew turning your aeroplane. At the end of the day, it might be a bunch of Norwegians putting it to bed and putting the fuel in. And that's a really interesting concept and worked extremely well. And it allowed the guys at Wildenrath to turn other nations' aeroplanes and for us to land anywhere and people to understand what it was we needed. Last question from Minty. I don't believe that for a minute. He says, what's the next on the flying agenda for me? PPL? I don't know, mate, is the honest answer. I've looked at civilian flying, potentially maybe some flying club instruction. Maybe off to an air experience flight and give back to the Air Cadet organisation that gave me so much when I was a youth. I don't know. On the other hand, you know, I've been doing this for about 41 years now, and there's a little bit of me that kind of wants to point in a different direction and chill out and relax for a bit. I still ride big motorbikes, still do scuba diving, so it's not that I'm going to stop doing stupid stuff. It's just that when you've flown military aeroplanes for a living, I just don't think too much of what's out there left is interesting enough. Perhaps a bit of aerobatics in the pits would be interesting, but I just enjoyed everything I've done, but in the context that I've done. For the Freckle Pony, I don't have any experience of the seed variants of the Tornado. I know it looked very competent when we were developing it. I just don't know how that went, and it came in just after I'd left the force there. Zigzag Ground Zero again, favourite place I've flown, mil or civilian? 1,000 places, to be honest. Low level in Germany in the 80s was probably the most challenging and fun in equal measure. Lots and lots of aeroplanes out there, lots of fighting to do, and a lot of really interesting and challenging operations. If you're picking a place for the place, I've always enjoyed flying in the Falklands. I think I've done 8 tours down there altogether and over a year of my life spent in that place. But the pure flying is absolutely fantastic. The valleys and scenery are beautiful and the people are fantastic. If I was going to pick a place that's not mainline UK type stuff, without a doubt, Red Flag as an exercise is fantastic, and Vegas is a fantastic place to visit. The ranges are huge, sparsely populated, not many aeroplanes in it, and what you do there is massively challenging. So that in itself is really good. And I do hear that I've not flown in one. The current, some of the Joint Warrior series in the UK now are extremely demanding and good as well. So hope that gives you an insight into what I've enjoyed on that side of things. There's got one here, Jaegel Morgan, I love your accent. I don't have an accent, my dear, I'm British. Moving on a little bit now down the road, Paul Vernals. How will the F3 and the F4 perform on a single engine, i.e. takeoff and landing? We wouldn't take either other than in a wartime situation on one engine. So done lots of practice approaches on both. The F-4 had more excess power on the single engine, which gave you better single engine performance. But both were perfectly adequate on one engine to get you home and land. I wouldn't want to fight either, because not only have you lost half the thrust, but the non-functioning engine generally generates a whole pile of drag, particularly at speed. So if you lose one engine, bring it home is the way I'd kind of put it. Dragon Drummer 33, how would an F4 perform at max weight if you lost an engine at critical speed during takeoff? We used to use 100 knots as a kind of go-no-go decision. And 145 knots, I think, was get it off the ground. We didn't have the V1, V2 type issues that you have in an airliner. So if you lost an engine below 100 knots, you stopped. If you were doing above 100 knots, you could get it off the ground. The F3 had a whole bunch of calculations, and you were more conscious of the don't go speeds, much like an airliner does these days. Moving down just a little bit further, are we going here? What we got there? MKMD Exploration. How was the Phantom on a performance takeoff? Clean aeroplane. The performance takeoff we used to do was brakes to 82%, brakes off, full power, engine stabilized, min reheat, feel it bite, check the nozzles have moved to the right place, full reheat. You pulled the stick back to your stomach in there for takeoff, and you waited until the nose wheel came off. You then moved the stick forward to stop the nose coming up anymore, and then the aircraft left the ground naturally. On a normal takeoff, you'd climb away at about, I guess, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. What you do for performance takeoff was hold the aircraft level, probably at about 20 feet while the gear came up. Once the gear was clean, you'd stay at that height down the runway, aiming for 350 knots. And at 350 knots, you'd select about 2.5 G. You could get the aeroplane to the vertical before you had to unload, and then it would climb quite nicely. If you wanted to sustain a takeoff to height on performance, then you probably only climbed to about 30, 35 degrees nose up and held that, and then that was the best compromise of angle against keeping the speed going. It was pretty exciting, and it was pretty good fun to do as well.
So, Mids, I'm just going to interject here, because we're wrapping up the final part of the Q&A. I'm going to let you pick 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up, if that's okay, Mids.
Yeah, sure. Okay, final question. If I may, I'll select one from Aj Harby. He says, it's a different plane, but you know why the F-104 has a carrier hook, even though it isn't a naval aircraft. Tornado F-3 has a carrier hook, even though it's not a naval aircraft. Both are very similar. In fact, the vast majority of that generation of fast jets have a hook of some description. The hook's designed as an emergency measure. So most military airfields have an approach end and an overrun cable. Wire cable strung across the runway, generally raised to about 4 inches off the ground, either on metal carriers, which can be automatic, or on rubber grommets, which are dragged across to hold the cable up and be evenly spaced. That's there. If you're a carrier airplane, you have a hook, great, but it's there in case you lose the hydraulics and have no brakes. So if you have a hydraulic braking system, you lose the hydraulics, then the hook come wire system is there for you to drop into. It stops you in about 700 feet. So the average one actually, is 1,300 feet, unless you have a PUAG, which is an old pneumatic cable, which we used to have at Lucas, which was a carrier cable, which stopped you in 700 feet. And it's designed there for when the brakes don't work, you've lost your hydraulics, it's all looking pretty bad, then you can just use the crocheting hook to catch the cable, and it stops you, and there you go. I think that's about it. Hope that's answered everybody's questions. I have, as always, enjoyed having a look through the questions as they come in. It's been great fun to answer your questions, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. Mike, thank you very much. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. Sorry about that if my mic was a bit loud there. We're having some technical difficulties on my end for my mic, so apologies for that. But yeah, absolutely. What a great Q&A there, Mid. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's always great to have you on. So hopefully you guys in the comments have enjoyed it, and hopefully Mid's answered your questions how you wanted them. So yeah, Mids, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure as always.